The white-haired man bought roses from the vendor across the street every Tuesday morning, walked them through the rain or sun to Violet's shop, and left them on her counter without asking for anything in return. Violet Pemberton had owned Thornwood Blooms for 3 years, and in all that time she'd never met anyone quite like him. His name was Iskander Calanther, though she'd learned that only after the 5th bouquet, when she'd finally cornered him before he could slip away with that small, knowing smile that made her heart stutter in her chest. "You don't have to keep doing this," she'd told him, holding the latest arrangement, pale pink roses threaded with baby's breath. "I work with flowers all day. I don't need them." "I'm aware," he'd said, and his voice carried the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place, something old-world and refined. "But you smile differently when you receive them. That's reason enough." She'd opened her mouth to argue, but he was already gone, the bell above her door chiming softly in his wake. That had been 2 months ago. The flowers kept coming. Violet had grown used to finding them waiting when she arrived each morning, though she never caught him in the act of leaving them. The arrangements varied, sometimes tulips, sometimes lilies, once an extravagant cascade of orchids that must have cost a fortune. She kept them all, rotating them through the shop displays and taking the older ones home to her small apartment above a bakery on 7th Street. Her assistant, Maya, thought it was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. "He's clearly obsessed with you," Maya said one morning, arranging the latest delivery deep red dahlias in a crystal vase. "Rich, gorgeous, and he brings you flowers. What more do you need?" "I don't even know him," Violet protested, though the argument felt weak even to her own ears. She knew more than she wanted to admit. She knew he wore expensive clothes that looked vintage rather than fashionable, that his hands were always cold when they accidentally brushed hers, that he never came in during the brightest part of the day. She knew he made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had. "So get to know him," Maya said. "Ask him out. Be bold." Violet laughed, but the idea lodged itself in her mind and wouldn't leave. She saw him again that afternoon. He didn't come into the shop, he never did, except for those secret morning deliveries, but she spotted him through the window, standing beneath the awning of the coffee shop next door. The autumn rain had turned vicious, and pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas bent against the wind. Iskander stood perfectly still, watching the storm with an expression of mild interest. Violet grabbed her coat and umbrella and went out before she could talk herself out of it. "You'll catch your death standing out here," she called over the sound of the rain. He turned, and his face transformed. The distant regal mask he wore for the world melted into something warmer, something that made her stomach flip. "Miss Pemberton, are you checking on me?" "Someone has to." She held the umbrella over both of them, though he was already soaked. Up close, she could see that his hair was pure white, not blonde, and his skin had a pallor that should have looked sickly but instead seemed almost luminous. His eyes were an impossible shade of amber, flecked with gold. "You're drenched." "I don't mind the rain." "Well, I mind that you're standing in it like some kind of tragic poetry character." She didn't know where this boldness was coming from, but she ran with it. "Have coffee with me, properly, not just you watching me through windows like some kind of beautiful stalker." His mouth quirked. "Beautiful?" She flushed. "Are you going to make me take it back?" "Never." He offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "Lead the way." They went to the coffee shop, though Iskander didn't order anything, claiming he'd already eaten. Violet got a latte and a blueberry scone and tried not to feel self-conscious under the weight of his attention. "Tell me about yourself," she said, "and not just the mysterious art dealer story, real things. What makes you think the art dealer story isn't real? Because you look at paintings like you knew the artists personally." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Observant? It's my job. I look at living things all day and figure out what they need." She broke off a piece of scone. "So?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "I've lived in this city for a very long time. I've seen it change, grow, become something its founders wouldn't recognize. I deal in art because beautiful things matter to me. They're how we mark time, how we prove we were here." That's a very philosophical answer for a Tuesday afternoon. "You asked for real things." "I did." She studied him, the sharp lines of his face, the way he held himself like royalty trying to pass as common. "Why the flowers, Iskander?" "Because you deserve them." That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. He met her eyes, and the intensity there stole her breath. You have the most extraordinary smile. It changes your entire face. The first time I saw it, you were helping an old woman choose flowers for her wife's birthday, and you were so patient, so genuinely happy to be part of that moment. I thought... He paused. I thought I'd forgotten what real joy looked like. You reminded me. Violet's chest felt too tight. So you started buying me flowers. From the vendor across the street, yes, it seemed less presumptuous than walking into your shop and declaring myself. You could have just asked me out like a normal person. I'm not sure I remember how to be normal. She laughed, and his expression softened in that way that made her feel like the only person in the world. They talked for 2 hours until the rain stopped and the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Iskander walked her back to her shop, and this time when he said goodbye, he took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Tomorrow? He asked. Tomorrow, she agreed. He brought her peonies the next morning, pale pink and cream, already arranged in a vintage glass vase. Violet found them waiting on her counter, along with a note in elegant script, for brightening my world. Maya read the note over her shoulder and made an inhuman squealing sound. You have to marry him. We've had one coffee date. Details. When's the next one? Tonight, Violet admitted, and couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. Iskander took her to a private gallery opening, or what he claimed was a gallery opening, though Violet suspected he'd arranged the entire thing just for her. The space was a renovated warehouse in the arts district, all exposed brick and soaring ceilings, filled with paintings that ranged from Renaissance oils to modern abstracts. Do you know the artists? She asked, studying a particular landscape that looked centuries old. Some of them. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his body. That one was painted in 1642 in the Low Countries. The artist was trying to capture the light after a storm. Ah, you sound like you were there. I have a good memory for history. She turned to face him. You're very mysterious, you know. Is that a problem? I haven't decided yet. She stepped closer, emboldened by the wine she had had, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the room. What are you hiding, Iskander Kalanther? For a moment she thought he might tell her. His amber eyes searched her face, and something ancient and heavy moved behind them. Then he smiled, soft and almost sad. And the moment passed. Nothing that matters, he said. Not when I'm with you. They walked through the gallery together, and he told her stories about each piece, the context, the technique, the tiny details that revealed the artist's true intentions. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd studied art history for a lifetime, but also with an intimacy that suggested something more. You really did know them, Violet said quietly. The artists? He didn't deny it. Some. How old are you? Old enough to know better than to fall for a brilliant florist with a smile that could resurrect the dead. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious, and too selfish to stay away. I don't want you to stay away. You should. He cupped her face with one cold hand. I'm not what you think I am, Violet. Then tell me what you are. But he kissed her instead, and the world narrowed to the press of his lips against hers, the careful way he held her like she might break, the centuries of loneliness she could taste in his desperation. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. I should take you home, he said. You should. He didn't. They stayed until the gallery closed, talking and touching and learning each other in the quiet spaces between words. Iskander told her about his love of music, how he'd watched opera evolve from religious spectacle to popular entertainment. She told him about growing up in foster care, how flowers had been the first thing she'd learned to nurture, how building her shop had felt like finally planting roots. You're extraordinary, he said, and the reverence in his voice made her believe it. When he finally walked her home, the streets were empty and the moon was high. Violet's apartment was dark, the bakery below closed for the night. She stood on the stairs with her keys in her hand and tried to find the courage to ask him up. I won't come in tonight, Iskander said, reading her mind, but not because I don't want to. Then why? Because I need to be sure. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I need to be sure I can keep you safe. Safe from what? From everything I am, everything I bring with me. He kissed her forehead, gentle and final. Sleep well, Violet Pemberton. Dream of flowers and sunshine and all the things that don't belong to the night. He was gone before she could ask what he meant. The flowers continued. Every morning, a new bouquet, each more beautiful than the last, ranunculus and sweet peas, anemones and forget-me-nots. Lily of the valley arranged with such care that Violet sometimes found herself crying over them, overwhelmed by the tenderness they represented. They saw each other every evening. Dinner at quiet restaurants where Iskander never ate, late-night walks through the city's oldest neighborhoods, a private concert in a historic theater where he held her hand and watched her face instead of the stage. "Why don't you ever eat?" she asked one night, emboldened by champagne and curiosity. "I have a restricted diet." That's a non-answer. "I know." He traced patterns on the back of her hand. "Ask me something else. Why don't you come around during the day?" "I'm sensitive to sunlight, a medical condition." "Why is your skin always so cold?" "Poor circulation." "Why do you look at me like I'm going to disappear?" That stopped him. He was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because everyone I've ever loved has disappeared. Died, left, been taken. I've learned not to trust happiness. It's made me careful. Too careful, maybe." Violet's heart ached. She thought about those first bouquets, the way he'd left them without asking for acknowledgement, the way he still sometimes watched her from a distance, as if afraid to come too close. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You can't promise that." "Neither can you. That's what makes it worth it." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "You're braver than I am." "Then be brave with me." They went back to her apartment that night. Iskander moved through her small space like he was memorizing it, touching her books, studying the flowers he'd given her that she'd kept long past their prime, examining the photos on her walls. "No family," he observed. "Not the traditional kind. I have friends. Maya, the regular customers who've become something more." She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I have you." He turned in her embrace. "You don't know what you have. So tell me. If I do, everything changes." "Maybe it needs to." He kissed her then, deep and hungry, and she felt the sharp press of something against her lower lip. When she pulled back, startled, his eyes were closed and his jaw was clenched. "Iskander? I need to go." "What just happened?" "Please, Violet, let me go." She did, because the anguish in his voice frightened her. He left without another word, and she stood alone in her apartment, touching her lip where she'd felt that sharp edge, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The flowers didn't come the next morning. Violet tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she'd known from the beginning that Iskander was keeping secrets, that maybe this was for the best. But her chest felt hollow, and the shop seemed too bright, without the anticipation of finding his gift waiting for her. Maya noticed immediately. "Where are the flowers?" "I don't know." "Did you fight?" "Not exactly." Violet arranged a bouquet for a wedding order, her hands moving on autopilot. "I think I scared him off." "By doing what?" "Asking for the truth." Maya made a thoughtful sound. "Men are weird about vulnerability. This is different." Violet couldn't explain the feeling in her gut, the certainty that Iskander's secrets were bigger and stranger than simple emotional unavailability. "I think he's been hurt before. Badly." "Then give him space to come back." But 3 days passed with no word, and Violet's certainty began to crack. She walked past the coffee shop where they had had their first date and felt his absence like a physical wound. She went to the gallery district and imagined him standing in those empty spaces surrounded by centuries of beauty and utterly alone. On the 4th day, she closed the shop early and went to the address listed on the business card he'd given her weeks ago. It led her to a building she'd passed 100 times without really seeing, a narrow Gothic revival townhouse wedged between modern apartments, its facade dark stone and leaded glass. She rang the bell and waited. Nothing happened. She rang again, pressing the button for a full 5 seconds. The door opened. Iskander stood in the gap, and he looked terrible. His white hair was disheveled, his clothes rumpled, and there was a wildness in his amber eyes that made her breath catch. "Violet, you shouldn't be here." You don't get to decide that. She pushed past him into a foyer that was all dark wood and antique furniture, lit by candles despite the early evening hour. You don't get to kiss me like that, make me fall for you, and then disappear without explanation. I'm trying to protect you. From what? She spun to face him, anger and fear mixing into something combustible. You keep saying that, but you won't tell me what the danger is. How am I supposed to make choices about my own life when you're keeping me in the dark? Because the truth will change how you see me. Good. I want to see you, all of you, not just the parts you think I can handle. He looked at her with such longing it hurt. You fell first. You said yes when I asked you for coffee. You let me into your life. You made me believe I could have this. But I've lived centuries, learning that love makes people vulnerable. Everyone I've cared for has paid the price for my affection. Violet's mind snagged on one word. Centuries. Iskander closed his eyes. Yes. That's not possible. It is if you're not human. The words hung in the air between them. Violet's heart was hammering, but not with disbelief. Too many things suddenly made sense. The cold skin, the avoidance of daylight, the way he spoke about history like a lived experience. What are you? She whispered. He opened his eyes and they'd changed. The amber had brightened to molten gold, and there was an otherness to them now, a predatory gleam he'd kept hidden before. When he spoke, she saw the points of fangs behind his lips. I am Iskander Calanthir, king of the northern courts, keeper of the ancient ways. I've ruled my kind for 800 years, and I'm vampire. The word should have sent her running. Instead, Violet found herself taking a step closer. Show me. Violet, show me. If you want me to understand, if you want me to make an informed choice, show me what you are. So he did. He let the glamour drop completely, and she saw him as he truly was, skin like alabaster, hair the pure white of fresh snow, eyes that glowed in the candlelight. He was beautiful in a way that didn't seem quite real, too perfect to be human, too otherworldly to be safe. She reached out and touched his face, tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. You're freezing. Always. The dead don't generate heat. You're not dead. You're standing here talking to me. Semantics. But his voice had softened. You're not afraid. Should I be? Most humans would be. I'm not most humans. She moved closer still until they were sharing breath. And you've been terrified this whole time, haven't you? Afraid I'd find out and run. Afraid I'd stay and get hurt. Afraid to be happy. His hands came up to frame her face, and the cold of his touch felt right, felt like him. 300 years ago, I loved a human woman. Her name was Elena. She was a painter, brilliant and fierce and unafraid of the darkness. I courted her in secret, but my affection made her a target. My enemies found her, used her to draw me out. By the time I reached her, she was already dead. Violet's throat tightened. I'm sorry. I swore I'd never make that mistake again. I've been alone since then, moving through the world without attachment, without joy. And then I saw you smile at that old woman in your shop, and I remembered what it felt like to want something more than survival. The flowers, she said, understanding. You were trying to love me from a distance, where it was safe. Where you were safe, he corrected. I told myself that if I never claimed you, never made you part of my world, you'd be protected. But I'm a selfish creature, Violet. I kept coming back. I kept hoping. Hoping for what? That maybe this time would be different. She kissed him then, rising onto her toes to press her lips to his. He made a sound low in his throat and pulled her close, and there was nothing careful about it now. His fangs grazed her lower lip again, but this time she didn't pull away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard despite his lack of need for air, she said, It will be different, because I'm not going to hide. You have to. If my enemies know about you, then they'll know I'm protected by the Vampire King, that I'm not some secret weakness they can exploit, but someone you've chosen openly, someone who belongs in your world. He stared at her. That's not how it works. Why not? You're the king, aren't you? Make it work. The risk is the same either way. If they want to hurt you, they'll find a way. At least if I'm visible, I'm not an easy target. I'm a statement. She took his hands in hers. You've been hiding love for 300 years, Iskander. Maybe that's what killed Elena. The secrecy, the isolation, the fact that she was vulnerable because no one knew she mattered to you. He was silent for a long time, working through the implications. She could see the moment the idea took hold, the way his expression shifted from fear to consideration to something that might have been hope. You're asking me to present you to the courts. I'm asking you to stop being afraid of happiness. They'll think you're mad, a human in the court of vampires. Let them think what they want. I'm not doing it for them. She squeezed his hands. I'm doing it for us, because I've fallen completely in love with you, and I'm not interested in being a secret. His eyes closed, and when they opened again, they were bright with unshed tears. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. He laughed, and it sounded like something breaking open, like centuries of grief finally cracking to let light through. Then he swept her into his arms and kissed her, like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. They spent the night talking. Iskander told her about the vampire world, the hidden courts beneath the city, the complex politics that governed the undead, the ancient laws and older feuds. He told her about his rule, how he'd taken the throne during a period of chaos and brought stability through strength and strategy. He told her about the enemies he'd made, the rivals who would see his affection for a human as weakness. Violet listened and asked questions and refused to be intimidated. She'd built a business from nothing, survived a childhood without family, created beauty in a world that often felt harsh and cold. She could handle vampire politics. We'll need to be strategic, Iskander said as dawn approached. I can't just walk you into court and declare you my consort. There are protocols, alliances to consider. So what do we do? He was quiet, thinking. Then a slow expression of understanding crossed his face. We make you impossible to ignore. We show them that you're not hidden away, not vulnerable, but a presence in your own right. How? The Spring Festival. It's in 2 weeks, the largest public gathering in the city. I'll make a statement there. Something no one can miss. What kind of statement? His expression turned calculating. Leave that to me. You just keep doing what you do, being brilliant and brave and entirely too good for me. She left before the sun rose, Iskander insisting on having his driver take her home. She went back to her apartment and slept for 3 hours, then woke and went down to the shop. The flowers were waiting. Not just a bouquet this time, but an entire display. Hundreds of white roses arranged in a cascade that spilled across her counter and onto the floor, filling the shop with their scent. Nestled among them was a note. For the woman who taught a dead king how to live again. Maya arrived 20 minutes later and stopped dead in the doorway. What happened? I met his family, Violet said, which was technically true. It went well. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Iskander came to her every evening, and they fell into a rhythm dinner that only she ate, walks through the city's secret places, long nights spent talking and touching and learning the geography of each other's lives. He told her about being turned in the 13th century, about the vampire who'd made him and the wars he'd fought to survive. She told him about the foster homes, the loneliness, the determination that had carried her through. We're both fighters, she said one night, curled against him on her couch. You more than I, he replied. I had the advantage of immortality and inhuman strength. You had nothing but your own will. I had hope. That's more powerful than strength. He kissed the top of her head. You're teaching me to hope again. It's terrifying. Good. I like you a little bit scared. It keeps you humble. He laughed, and the sound was becoming familiar, something she could draw out of him with increasing ease. She met some of his world during those weeks. Not the full court that would wait until the festival, but a few of his inner circle. First came Iskander, his second in command, a stern vampire with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. She's human, Iskander said flatly, studying Violet like she was a particularly confusing puzzle. Obviously, Violet replied. And you're aware of what you're involving yourself in? Vampire politics, ancient feuds, potential assassination attempts. Did I miss anything? Iskander blinked. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. I see why he likes you. Next was Seraphine, a vampire woman who'd been Iskander's ally for 5 centuries. She was breathtaking, with hair like spun gold and a laugh that could charm birds from trees. "Finally," she said when Iskander introduced them. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to feel anything." "I was trying to," Iskander admitted. "Well, stop, it's boring." Seraphine turned to Violet. "He's going to be impossibly overprotective. Don't let him smother you." "I won't." "Good. We'll be friends." They were. Seraphine became a frequent visitor to the flower shop, charming customers and offering unsolicited advice about Iskander's weaknesses. "He's terrible at accepting help," she confided one afternoon. "Thinks he has to handle everything alone. You'll need to push back." "I'm getting that impression. Also, he hasn't been happy in centuries. The fact that you can make him laugh is basically a miracle. Don't let him forget that." Violet promised she wouldn't. The spring festival approached. Iskander grew more intense as the date neared, planning something he refused to fully explain. "Trust me," he kept saying. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you mean to me." "You're being mysterious again." "I'm being romantic. There's a difference." The night before the festival, he didn't come to see her. Instead, he sent a gown of deep purple silk that fit her perfectly, along with a note that said simply, "Tomorrow, I show the world my heart. Wear this and know that you are cherished beyond measure." Violet hung the dress in her window and tried not to cry. The festival itself was a sprawling affair that took over the city's largest square. Food vendors and artists, musicians and performers, thousands of people gathered to celebrate the arrival of spring. Violet arrived in the late afternoon, wearing the purple dress and feeling conspicuous and beautiful. She found Iskander near the center of the square, standing beside a raised platform that had been erected for announcements and performances. He was dressed in black, stark and elegant, his white hair pulled back to reveal the sharp angles of his face. When he saw her, everything else ceased to exist. He crossed the space between them in seconds, taking her hands in his. "You're stunning. You're biased. Completely." He kissed her knuckles, then her lips, and she heard the murmur of voices around them, people noticing, pointing. "Are you ready?" "For what exactly?" He gestured to the square, and for the first time, she noticed the preparations happening around them. Workers were carrying in flowers, thousands of them, every variety she'd ever sold, and many she'd only dreamed of. Roses and peonies, tulips and dahlias, orchids and hydrangeas, all in shades of purple and white and pink. "What is this?" she breathed. "This is me, refusing to hide." He led her toward the platform as the flowers continued to arrive, filling the square with color and scent. "This is me telling everyone who matters and everyone who doesn't that I love you, that you are mine and I am yours, and anyone who wants to make a target of you will have to come through me first." Tears stung her eyes. "Iskander." "I'm not finished." He guided her onto the platform, and she realized the entire square was watching now, hundreds of faces turned toward them. "I've spent 300 years afraid to love anyone, afraid of loss, of pain, of vulnerability. You changed that. You walked into my life with your impossible smile and your stubborn courage, and you made me remember what it felt like to be alive." Around them, the flowers continued to multiply. The square was transforming into a garden, a riot of blooms that seemed to appear from nowhere, carried in by vampires she recognized from Iskander's inner circle. Lysander and Seraphine were both there, directing the placement with military precision. "I brought you flowers every morning," Iskander continued, his voice carrying across the square, "because I was afraid to bring you anything more, afraid to bring you myself, the darkness and danger I represent. But you refused to accept my fear. You demanded more. You demanded truth and honesty, and a future that didn't involve hiding in shadows." The last of the flowers were placed massive arrangements at the edges of the square, creating a border of living color that enclosed them all. Violet looked around, overwhelmed by the beauty, the audacity, the sheer impossibility of it. "So this is my answer," Iskander said. He took both her hands and went to one knee on the platform, and Violet's heart stopped. "I am Iskander Calanther, king of the northern courts, and I am hopelessly, completely in love with Violet Pemberton, who sells flowers and believes in hope and makes me want to be better than I am." The crowd was silent, entranced. I'm not asking you to join my world, he said. I'm asking if I can be part of yours. If you'll have me, with all my complications and centuries of baggage. If you'll let me love you openly, publicly, dangerously. If you'll be my partner, my equal, the person I choose above all others. Violet was crying openly now. You brought me flowers. I'll bring you flowers every day for the rest of your life if you'll let me. Even though I said you didn't have to. Especially because you said I didn't have to. He smiled up at her, and it was radiant, unguarded, full of joy. I love making you smile, Violet. It's become my favorite thing in the world. Say yes, and I'll spend eternity finding new ways to do it. She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, and the crowd erupted in cheers. When they finally broke apart, both laughing, Iskander produced a ring, an antique piece with a purple stone that matched her dress. This belonged to my mother, he said quietly, just for her. She'd have loved you. Your strength, your refusal to be diminished. She'd have said I was lucky you agreed to tolerate me. I do more than tolerate you, Violet said as he slipped the ring onto her finger. I adore you, even when you're being dramatic and filling entire city squares with flowers. Especially then, I hope. Especially then. They stayed in the square as evening fell, surrounded by flowers and music and the press of well-wishers. Vampires and humans both approached to offer congratulations, and Violet met them all with her characteristic warmth. She saw Lysander watching from the edge of the crowd, a small smile on his usually stern face. Seraphine was openly crying, which she tried to hide when Violet caught her eye. This is going to complicate things, Iskander murmured at one point. The other courts won't know what to make of it. A vampire king with a human consort. Let them figure it out. We'll be too busy being happy to care. He laughed and pulled her close, and Violet rested her head against his chest, listening to the silence where his heartbeat should have been. It didn't bother her. He was here, solid and real, and he'd chosen her just as fiercely as she'd chosen him. As night deepened and the festival continued around them, Iskander led her away from the crowds to a quieter corner of the square. The flowers were still everywhere, glowing in the lamplight, and the air was sweet with their scent. Thank you, he said quietly, for refusing to hide, for being brave when I couldn't be, for showing me that love doesn't have to be a weakness. It's not weak to care about people. It's the strongest thing we can do. I'm learning that. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. I love you, Violet Pemberton. More than I thought I could love anything. I love you too, even though you're dramatic and mysterious and you buy flowers from the vendor across the street instead of just taking mine for free. Yours are for customers, mine are just for you. She smiled, and he drank in the sight of it like a man dying of thirst. They were married a month later, in a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions. Violet wore white, and Iskander wore black, and Seraphine cried through the entire thing while Lysander stood stoic and approving. The flower shop was closed for the day, filled instead with their closest friends and family, the odd, chosen collection of people they'd gathered around themselves. Maya was maid of honor, and she spent most of the reception telling anyone who would listen about how she'd known from the first bouquet that they were meant to be together. I have excellent instincts, she declared. I should start a matchmaking service. Please don't, Violet said, but she was laughing. The reception was held in Iskander's townhouse, which Violet had slowly been making more her own. She'd added plants and warm colors, softened the Gothic severity with touches of life. It was a work in progress, a blending of their worlds, and it felt like home. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and only the closest remained, Iskander found her standing in the garden he'd created for her, a greenhouse attached to the townhouse, filled with every flower imaginable. Happy? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Deliriously, she leaned back against him. Though I still can't believe you filled an entire square with flowers. I wanted to make a statement. You succeeded. I had to. You're worth grand gestures. She turned in his arms. I would have loved you just as much with a single rose. I know, but I've spent centuries being careful, being measured. Let me be excessive in my love for you. Let me bring you flowers every day and fill squares and generally be absurd about how much I adore you. When you put it that way, how can I refuse? They kissed in the greenhouse surrounded by blooms and the promise of forever. Violet had never believed in fairy tales, but this felt close, a love that had survived centuries of grief, a happiness earned through courage and honesty. Outside, spring was in full bloom, and the world was alive with possibility. The months that followed were an adjustment. Violet kept her shop, refusing to give up the work she loved, though she had to hire additional help to cover the times she spent attending to her new role. Being the consort of a vampire king came with responsibilities she hadn't fully anticipated: state functions, diplomatic meetings, navigating the complex social structure of the undead. But she approached it the same way she approached everything else, with practical determination and refusal to be intimidated. "You're a natural at this," Seraphine said one evening, after Violet had successfully negotiated a trade agreement between two feuding vampire houses. "Most humans would be terrified." "I deal with bridezillas and last-minute funeral orders," Violet replied. "Vampire politics is just another version of customer service." Seraphine laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. There were challenges, of course. Some vampires resented having a human in a position of influence. There were whispered criticisms, pointed comments, a few outright insults. Violet learned to handle them with the same grace she brought to difficult customers: polite, firm, and utterly unbending. Iskander, for his part, was learning to trust her strength. He still had moments of overprotectiveness, times when the fear of losing her made him want to lock her away from danger. But Violet had become adept at recognizing those moments and calling him on them. "I'm not Elena," she told him one night, after he'd tried to convince her not to attend a particularly contentious court meeting. "I'm not vulnerable because I'm human. I'm powerful because you love me and because I love you. That's what your enemies can't touch." He'd stared at her, then pulled her into his arms. "You're right. I know you're right. It's just hard to let go of 300 years of fear." "I know." She kissed his jaw. "But you're doing it. Every day you're doing it." And he was. Slowly, deliberately, Iskander was learning to let her stand beside him rather than behind him. He introduced her to the full court, presented her not as a protected possession, but as his partner and equal. It caused ripples, but they weathered them together. The threats that did come, they handled as a team. When a rival vampire attempted to use Violet's shop as leverage, Iskander didn't rush in to solve it alone. Instead, he and Violet worked together, using her knowledge of the business and his political connections to neutralize the threat. When a human hate group targeted vampires and their allies, it was Violet who organized the community response, bringing together humans and vampires in a show of solidarity that made the news and shifted public opinion. "You're changing things," Lysander told her one evening. "The way the courts interact with humans, the way we see ourselves in the modern world. You're making us better." "I'm just being myself." "Exactly." The first year of their marriage passed, then the second. Violet's shop thrived, expanding to a second location. Iskander's rule became more progressive, more open, influenced by her presence and perspective. They traveled carefully, always mindful of his sensitivity to sunlight, and Violet saw parts of the world she'd only dreamed about. But her favorite moments were still the quiet ones. Mornings when she woke to find a fresh bouquet on the nightstand, Iskander already awake and reading beside her. Evenings spent in their greenhouse, her hands in the soil while he watched and asked questions about root systems and bloom cycles. Nights when they lay tangled together, talking about everything and nothing, his cold skin familiar and beloved. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her one night, 2 years into their marriage. "Tying yourself to someone who can't give you a normal life?" "What's normal?" She traced the line of his jaw. "I have a life full of love and purpose. I have work I care about, friends who matter, a partner who brings me flowers even though I told him he doesn't have to. What more could I want? Children. A family that's yours by blood." They discussed it before the impossibility of biological children with a vampire, the complexity of adoption given his nature. It was one of the few things that made Violet genuinely sad. "We could adopt," she said carefully, "if you wanted. There are children who need homes, who would benefit from what we could offer. You'd want that? Raising a child in this world? I was raised in worse, and they'd have us, both of us. That would make all the difference." They started the process a month later. It took time, extensive background checks, meetings with social workers, questions about how they'd protect a child given Iskander's unusual nature and the dangers of his position. But Violet was persistent, and Iskander used every resource at his disposal, and eventually they were approved. They brought home a little girl named Iris, 5 years old, with dark curls and eyes that had seen too much sadness. She was quiet at first, uncertain, but Violet knew how to be patient. She taught Iris about flowers, let her help in the shop, created a routine that was stable and safe. Iskander, to Violet's delight, was instantly smitten. He had spent centuries as a warrior and king, but fatherhood transformed him into something softer. He read Iris bedtime stories in his archaic accent, taught her to appreciate art and music, and fiercely protected her right to simply be a child. "She called me Papa today," he told Violet one evening, and his voice cracked with emotion. "She loves you." "I never thought I didn't know I could have this." Violet pulled him close. "You deserve this, all of it, happiness and family and a life that's more than survival." They added 2 more children over the next few years, a boy named Rowan, who came to them at 7, angry and afraid, and another girl, Lily, barely 3 and already showing signs of the trauma she'd endured. Violet and Iskander loved them fiercely, created a home that was safe and full of laughter, and watched them heal. The children knew what Iskander was. They had to, for their own safety. But it never frightened them. To them, he was just Papa, the one who could tell stories about history because he'd lived it, who was strong enough to carry them all at once, who loved their mother with a devotion that made the whole world feel secure. "Our family is weird," Rowan announced one dinner, 10 years old and matter-of-fact. "Definitely," Violet agreed, "but it's good weird." "The best weird," Iris added. Lily, now 5, just nodded seriously and went back to arranging her peas into a flower pattern. Iskander caught Violet's eye across the table, and the love in his expression made her throat tight. They'd built this. Together. A family, a life, a future that honored both their worlds. The shop continued to thrive, now run mostly by Maya with Violet's guidance. Violet had stepped back to focus on the children, though she still came in regularly to work with the flowers and maintain the connections she'd built. The shop had become something of a landmark, the place where the vampire king had courted his human wife, the source of those legendary bouquets. "People come in just to hear the story," Maya reported. "I've told it so many times I could do it in my sleep." "Embellish as needed," Violet said. "I don't mind." "Oh, I have been. Last week I told someone he filled the shop with 1,000 roses before you'd even agreed to coffee." "That's not true." "But it's romantic. And he probably would have if you'd asked." Violet couldn't argue with that. 20 years into their marriage, Violet began to notice the changes. The aches that didn't used to be there, the way her hands weren't quite as steady when she worked with delicate arrangements. She was aging, while Iskander remained frozen in immortal perfection, and though she'd known it would happen, the reality was harder than she'd anticipated. "We should talk about it," Iskander said one evening. They were alone in the greenhouse, the children all grown now, Iris in college studying botany, Rowan working as a curator at the art museum, Lily still in high school and already planning her future. "About what?" "About the fact that you're mortal and I'm not. About what happens as you age and I don't. About the choice you'll eventually have to make." Violet was quiet. They'd danced around this topic for years, but Iskander had never pushed, never suggested she become like him. "You'd turn me? If I asked?" "If you asked, not before. It has to be your choice, freely made." He took her hand, studying the lines that were beginning to appear there. "But I want you to know it's an option, that you don't have to leave me. We could have forever, if you want it." "Forever is a long time." "I'm aware. I've lived a fair portion of it." He met her eyes. "But I've never wanted it more than I do now. Because of you, because of the life we've built. I would give you eternity, Violet, if you'll take it." She thought about it, really thought about it, about watching her children grow old while she remained young, about centuries stretching ahead, full of possibility and danger and love, about the flowers she could grow, the changes she could witness, the time she could spend with the man who'd taught her that love didn't have to be limited or safe to be real. "Not yet," she said finally. "I want to see the children settled. I want to age naturally for a while longer, to experience this part of life. But someday, yes. I'll say yes. Relief washed over his features. Someday is enough. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. Promise me something. Anything. Keep bringing me flowers, even after I'm like you, even when we're both ancient and terrible. Promise you'll still leave bouquets and love my smile and be absurdly romantic. He pulled her close, and his laugh was warm against her ear. I promise. I'll bring you flowers for the rest of time, Violet Calanther. Because you told me I didn't have to, and because making you happy is the greatest privilege of my existence. They stayed in the greenhouse until dawn threatened, talking about the future and the past and all the moments in between. Outside, spring was arriving again, the city waking to another year of growth and change. And on Violet's counter in the shop, Maya would find a bouquet waiting in the morning purple irises and white roses, arranged with the care of centuries and the devotion of a king who'd learned that love was worth the risk. The flowers never stopped coming. Through seasons and years, through joy and challenge, through the ordinary magic of a life shared. Iskander brought them because it made Violet smile, and her smile was the thing that had brought him back to life after 300 years of existing without truly living. It was a small gesture, really, just flowers, but it was everything. Years continued to unfold in their gentle rhythm. Violet watched her children build lives of their own, Iris opening a botanical research center that studied rare and endangered plants, Rowan becoming director of the city's premier art museum, Lily following her mother's footsteps into the flower business, and eventually taking over the shop completely. You built something that lasts, Iskander told her on their 30th anniversary, as they stood in the original shop that now had 6 locations across the city. We built it, she corrected. Your flowers started all of this. The grandchildren came. Iris had 2, Rowan had 1, and Lily was expecting twins. Violet held them and told them stories and taught them about flowers, and Iskander was the world's most dignified grandfather, utterly undone by tiny hands and trusting smiles. They make me feel human again, he confessed one evening, after a day spent watching the children play in the greenhouse. You never stopped being human, not in the ways that matter. At 55, Violet made her choice. The children were settled, happy. The grandchildren were healthy and thriving. She'd lived a full mortal life, experienced everything she'd wanted to experience, and she was ready for more. Are you certain? Iskander asked, even though she'd told him dozens of times. There's no going back. I've never been more certain of anything, except maybe that I loved you, that first time you brought me coffee. The transformation was painful, but Iskander was there through all of it, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, loving her through every moment of agony. When she finally opened her eyes to her new existence, the first thing she saw was his face, and the first thing she felt was hunger not for blood, though that would come, but for the life stretching ahead of them. Hello, immortal, he said softly. Hello, husband. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, clearer, sharper. Everything was sharper. She could hear the pulse of life in the city around them, smell the flowers in the greenhouse 3 floors away, see details in Iskander's face she'd never noticed before. How do you feel? Hungry? Strong. Like I could run to the ocean and back. She sat up, testing her new body. And I can still feel you. Here. She pressed a hand to her chest. Love doesn't die just because the heart stops beating. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They had to tell the children, of course. Iris and Rowan were adults now, old enough to understand and accept their mother's choice. Lily was the most emotional about it, but eventually she came around. You'll be here for all of it, she said, crying and laughing at the same time. The weddings and the grandchildren and everything, you won't have to leave. I won't have to leave, Violet confirmed, holding her daughter close. The years became decades. Violet learned to navigate her new existence, the strength, the speed, the hunger that Iskander taught her to manage with the control of centuries. She learned vampire politics and history, became a true partner in Iskander's rule rather than just his human consort. The courts, which had been skeptical of her mortality, found her immortal self even more formidable. She brought the same practical determination she had always had, but now backed by vampire strength and an endless supply of time to see her plans through. You've changed the courts more in 50 years than I did in 800, Iskander told her, watching her mediate a dispute between 2 ancient houses. I had a good teacher. I taught you politics. You brought the compassion on your own. They traveled the world, no longer constrained by her mortal limitations. They saw the places Iskander had lived through the centuries, and Violet understood him better for it, the depth of his loneliness, the weight of his years, the miracle of finding each other when they had. But no matter where they went, no matter what came, the flowers continued. Iskander brought them to her, sometimes wild blooms picked from fields they passed, sometimes rare specimens acquired through careful cultivation, sometimes simple bouquets from the shop that was now run by Lily's daughter. "You know I'm immortal now," Violet said, after one such delivery, a stunning arrangement of black tulips and white orchids. "I'll never age, never die. You don't have to keep proving your love." "I'm not proving anything." He pulled her close, and even after all these years, the touch still sent electricity through her. "I'm celebrating it. Every day I'm celebrating the fact that you chose me, that you refused to let me hide, that you loved me enough to demand I be brave. I love you more than brave. I love you completely. And I you, which is why the flowers will never stop, not in 100 years, not in 1,000, not until the stars burn out and the universe ends." He was true to his word. Through a century, then another, the flowers kept coming. Their family grew great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, a sprawling tree of descendants who all knew the story of how the vampire king had courted their grandmother with flowers. "It's the most romantic thing I've ever heard," one great-granddaughter sighed during a family gathering. "It's just flowers," Violet protested, though she was smiling. "It's not just flowers," Lily said, Lily, who was now a grandmother herself, gray-haired and beautiful. "It's a promise kept every single day. That's love. That's the real thing." Violet caught Iskander's eye across the room, and the warmth in his gaze made her feel like that young florist again, standing in her shop and trying to understand why a stranger kept bringing her roses. 200 years into their marriage, the city held a celebration in their honor, 2 centuries of leadership, of positive change, of proving that humans and vampires could not just coexist, but thrive together. The square where Iskander had once filled with flowers was now a permanent garden, maintained by the city and dedicated to their love. "This is absurd," Violet said, looking at the statues someone had commissioned the two of them, dancing, surrounded by carved flowers. "This is legacy," Iskander corrected. "Everything we built, everything we showed people was possible. They're celebrating that. They're romanticizing us. We are romantic." He took her hand, led her into the square. It was evening, the garden lit by thousands of tiny lights, and the air was sweet with the scent of living flowers. We're the vampire king and the florist who made him believe in love again. Let them celebrate that. Let them have the story. So they did. They danced in the garden while the city watched and cheered, and Violet felt the same joy she'd felt that first night at the spring festival, when Iskander had chosen to love her publicly and changed everything. Thank you," she said as they swayed together, "for the flowers, for the grand gestures, for all of it." "Thank you for smiling," he replied, "for being brave when I couldn't be, for showing me that love is worth the risk." The music played, and the lights glittered, and the flowers bloomed eternal, and in the center of it all, a vampire king held his wife, and knew that of all the conquests in his long existence, this was the greatest learning to love without fear, to hope without reservation, to bring flowers to the woman who'd taught him how to live, because she'd told him he didn't have to, and because he'd loved her smile too much to ever stop.